Howdy, hackers, and welcome to another episode of FairLight TV. Computers is a relatively new thing for mankind, but in the decade after World War II, a computer was something that filled a large room and it had the capacity of a pocket calculator. But today we carry around stuff like this, and they have more CPU power than NASA had jointly to send the first man to the moon. So the capacity has grown immensely. And I would like to bring you to a little expose how I think computer piracy fit into this. Why it has been an enabler for that progress. So over to progress via piracy. So the reason for making this episode is that one of my daughters graduated from university and she's now a master of computer science. And we had a big party celebrating this, and a number of her classmates were there, and I got to talk to a number of them. And to be honest, a lot of those are not really aware that they are the people standing on the shoulders of giants. People who went before them to develop or revolutionize the hardware and software as we see today, producing the services that we now take for granted. So my hypothesis here, to introduce a bit of a science to this, is that computer hardware and software people have learned, or many of them have learned this from having a home computer. So the early home computers were instrumental for producing the skills of the people who are now key participants and key producers of the hardware and software that we now take for granted. And the reason for them having that home computer was to a very, very large extent the fact that they had access to copies of games. They bought the computer to play games which they knew they could access for free from schoolmates or wherever, like a local club where they exchange games and you can gain access to them. You sold the idea of a home computer so that you could make your homework or record recipes or whatever rather silly arguments that were actually kind of put forwards towards parents. But the real reason was to play games, and the cracked games were such marketing arguments, if you will, for buying that home computer. So you typically bought the home computer your friends had because those were the ones where you could get games for. So in order for this to make theory, my hypothesis making it into theory, I of course need supporting data. Anecdotal evidence for me is that I bought my computer because my classmate Mats Möller had a C64 and we played games on it. And I really, really wanted to have that at home, not having to go to Mats to play them. I've asked around with a number of friends, and basically all of them, and I say basically all of them, to the best of my knowledge, all of them, but I do that just to make sure that I might have missed one or two. That might be sort of the exception to the rule here. They have the same line of arguments. They sold the idea to their parents because the parents thought it would be a good idea to do homework on and to record recipes. I had a presentation on a security event called SecT in Stockholm. And at the beginning of my speech, I also asked the audience if they also bought their first computer because that is what they could get access to games, cracked games to. And I would say all of them said yes. And these were, I don't know, like 200 people. So I would argue that cracked games sold more computers than any other argument. The cracked games made people want to buy computers. And we will get to the next step of that line of argument now. Okay, what is even this talk about piracy? What is it? So let's get back to the time we were. Back then, games were distributed as basically physical goods. This one, Frankie Goes to Hollywood, I should say. This is Modern Wars, so you went to a shop and you bought a physical copy of this. This is not really something that is done today. Today you go to one of the online stores like the Steams or whatever, and then you buy it there, and then you play everything. You never see like a physical instance. But back then, this was all we had. Everything was stored on a physical medium. And in order to ensure that every user who played the game played a game that they bought, to optimize revenue, of course, there were means introduced to ensure that the software stayed on the physical medium it was sold on. So basically binding the digital asset to the physical medium it was distributed over. So let me show you how it looked, because I'm also sure that these might be alien to you if you are like under 30. So when we listened to music, we had LPs, a vinyl record. This is before CDs. And then we had tapes. So this is a magnetic tape, and we have tape recorders to read those. And yeah, this is the leading part. So you would probably see a little red here. But if I wind it forward, you would see that this brown thing would also be displayed here. And then this is where the read head of a cassette player would be able to read it. So this is a standard cassette. So in order to ensure that, computers were as accessible as they could make them, the producers of the actual hardware ensured that there would be tape recorders that could use standard tapes, because then you could record your own software on standard tapes you can buy anywhere, because audio tapes, empty audio tapes were sold like everywhere. So they were really accessible and also cheap. And then we didn't need a monitor, because there was an RF interface on the computer, so you could connect it to any TV. So we used our normal TV, and then after we grew more interested in computers and possibly had saved up another bit of money, then we can buy an additional monitor to have like a separate TV just for our computer. So the question would then be, so how did the producer ensure that the software that sits on this physical tape stayed on this, so I couldn't copy this to a friend? Well, first of all, this is analog, so it's recorded in an analog way. So you could have tape recorders that had like two slots, one for a source tape and one for a destination tape, and then you could just copy. You had one, play on one and then play on record on the other one, and then you copied the content of that tape over to another. But as with like Xeroxing, if you copy a paper, that's also an analog copying process, and then the quality of the destination is always inferior to the quality of the source. And when it comes to software, if you're doing that, it might be that even when you do the first copy, the quality of the copy is so poor that you can't even play it. I mean, it could be that one bit of the read data is erroneous, and then you couldn't play it because you get a load error, because it's not proper. There is something in the loader that detects that the checksum of what was loaded is not correct, so it has to be faulty, so it wouldn't load. So that is one level of protection of a tape, the fact that it sits on a tape. This program also auto starts, so there you couldn't just insert this in your tape recorder, load it from the computer, and then save it to another tape. That would also be possible if it was as easy as loading and saving. But using the auto start function, then the tape content was sort of protected there on the tape. So this is where crackers step in. A cracker is a person who ensures that they read the content of a tape and then make a working copy from that, removing the auto start function and also removing the proprietary loader of this and storing it on a normal kind of DOS-based solution. So that is how tape cracking is done, circumventing the loading mechanisms and auto starts of the original tape and just distributing as a plain runnable file, which you could just load and save using normal DOS. Tapes. Okay, so discs. They came in different sizes and shapes. So this is a 5 1/4 inch, and I live in metric land, which means that I normally express everything in meters and centimeters and kilos and stuff. But these we are actually referencing as 5 1/4 inch anyway. So this was the predominant store mechanism. If you had a dedicated disk drive that came to read disks, then it would read this. Newer computers had 3.5 inch. They were little blue to begin with, and possibly black one as well. Hard plastic things that protected the disk a bit better. This has basically the same sort of metal coated little plastic film that runs around, and so this disc rotates inside this sleeve. When these were introduced, they were a lot more complex than the tape. Typically, for the C64, a disk drive had basically the same price as a computer. So if you bought your computer for, let's say, 500-600 euros, you would need to pay like 400 or 500 for the disk drive. So they were really expensive. And in the case of the Commodore 64, they are actually a little computer. They have their own CPU, they have their own RAM, and then you have the entire drive mechanism. So it's the communication there is like between two computers. So the area here is well, when you store something there, you had standard copy programs for copying the entire disk, and you had copy programs for copying normal files. And if you had a file that was small enough, you could just load it and then save it to a disk. So that's sort of how the DOS works, the disk operation system. It formats the disk and puts small containers, like areas of the disk that could hold a certain set of bytes, and then a structure to keep track of what container is linked with what other container to make up a file. So how did they do the copy protections of those? Well, they could be a lot more devious than they could on tape. They could do all sorts of trickery with the actual format of the disk, because if the copy program was built to copy standard DOS, it would read the containers and they would be erroneously formatted, making the copy program basically bug. And there was a cat and mouse game here that where producers of copy programs did smarter and smarter detections of errors, and they were able to reproduce those errors on a copy disk. Eventually, the producers of these games, the protected games, got into the level of complexity where you couldn't even reproduce the error on like native hardware. You needed to have dedicated writers to be able to actually write the data in its form where it's protected. So then we couldn't like copy it. And again, that's where the cracker steps in. A cracker takes this and makes a working copy that can be copied using normal DOS copiers without the protection, without running into the issue of protections. So the protection basically has like 3 layers to it. First, there is this error thing. That is the feature which cannot be reproduced. Then there is the second part, which is the piece of software that validates if the protection is still there. And then the third part, which is the obfuscation of the detection. Because if it was really possible to, or simple to identify the detection routine, then any kind of layman would be able to do it. So also here, the level of obfuscation of the detection routine was getting increasingly more and more difficult. So the producers of the software made it more and more difficult to defeat the copy protection. So that is copy protection of disks. So did pirate copies provide a path towards computers? I am absolutely sure that millions and millions bought their computers just to get access to games. Those computers were the breeding grounds of skills that they eventually brought into their professional lives. They produce services that we use today on computers or mobiles or in any other context. A lot of the people who are now kind of big names in the software industry and also in the hardware industry learned those tricks on their home computer, which they bought because of cracked games. That is my theory, and feel free to disagree. But it's still illegal, isn't it? Well, cracking isn't illegal, but copying the games to somebody else is illegal. In Sweden, we had the copyright law that enabled me to copy to a number of friends. So, but it's just the definition of friend that was very, very loose in the beginning. That shrunk into being very, very small. And well, legislation today is a bit different than it was back then. So I actually wrote my master thesis on law school on the topic. So I knew how it was in the 80s and 90s around this, but I didn't really follow all the trends of the legislation in the different countries on the topic. But basically, yes, it was illegal. And yes, it harmed sales for those initial companies. There are, of course, a number of companies that sold fewer copies of their games, like their first game or possibly their second game. But then the market grew. So because everybody bought a few games, most people would have a few games. It's just that they had possibly hundreds of copies, and then they had like half a dozen of legitly bought copies. And if the market is growing fast enough, very, very soon you would have so many computers and potential buyers of the new software that if you just survive the first few years in your software company, your market would have grown as well. So do I feel bad about this? That I've cracked like 200-300 games? Well, to be honest, not really. For me, I think FairLight as a group has contributed to sell so many computers for the platforms that where we have been involved. And I'm pretty sure that the software companies that survived the first few years actually benefited from that kind of leaking of elite cracked games to ensure that they would have a bigger base for their upcoming games. So no, I don't really feel bad for the cracking that was done on the C64 and on the Amiga, and possibly also what we did on the Super Nintendo. And to be honest, I know so many people who have done so many things, games and software and hardware and other things, treat they learn and to develop on the Commodore 64 and on the Commodore Amiga. So you should be happy that you are standing on the shoulders of the giants that made home computers sell a lot, and then all the services you now take for granted that we helped develop. Okay, sorry, this will be a bit of a boasting exercise here. So FairLight was founded in 1987, and we are one of the leading groups on multiple platforms, because there is a platform on the C64. So Commodore 64 was one of the technical platforms where we sort of did our thing. Commodore Amiga was another one. We did it on Super Nintendo, which was Nintendo's first 16-bit platform. We've done it on Sega's Mega Drive, which is also Sega's 16-bit platform, and we have done it on PC for many years. Based in Sweden originally, and we've had a number of years. Some have been members just for weeks or months, and some have been as long as me since 1988. So this, I will just scroll through a few of the things here that we have done. I mean, cracking games, I've already elaborated over that. We do have musicians releasing music. We do have graphicians who release their pictures, and there are competitions on regular gatherings for both those aspects. And then there is the competition around the production of demos, where a demo is an audiovisual presentation where you basically try to have the computer do things that it wasn't intended to do. Some of it is done through clever coding, and some of it is done through manipulating the VIC chip, so the graphics chip, into doing stuff that it wasn't intended to do, but if you know the trickery, it can still do it. So just scrolling here for you to watch it, and yeah, you can see the drag bar here, so where we are here. A lot was done already in the very original years of '87, and now we're getting into the part on CSDB, which isn't time set. All right, so that was FairLight on the C64. Let's do a bit of a scroll also on the Amiga, just for the fun of it. Poet, they are basically showing everything, so it's not just Amiga. You would have a C64 side there as well, or they are sort of mixed, so you would have all the platforms. But let's do it like this. So here you have PC, I guess this is DOS, and then you have a number of things on Windows, and then you have the Amiga part here. So these are Amiga, and then we run on C64. To be honest, this is just a subset, and these are only the legit releases. These are the demos. The list of FairLight releases on Amiga, the cracks. Yeah, I'm not really sure where to find that online, but we have produced a CD where all of them are actually collected, so we do have that. I can also show you Demo Zoo, which is also only focusing on the demo side. And here you would also have basically all the platforms collected. So it's not separated for C64, Amiga, or PC. All of them would be here. And yeah, I'll just make a slight scroll of the stuff that we have put out there. And again, I think, no, this is only the crack throw. So these should be all legit. Joe Blade, no. I might actually be wrong here. Taipan, that is for sure a game. Yeah, whatever. So Demo Zoo, it indicates that it would only be demos. C64 is my home platform, so I'm out of my depth here. But yeah, a lot of good things here as well. Let's see. Let's just pick one. Diamonds and Rust crack today. I'm not really sure if this is the entire thing or if it's just sort of the intro. And an intro here is a little piece of software that presents that we were the ones to crack this game. think of it like tagging. Like if you are a graffiti artist, you're tagging stuff with your name to ensure that people would know that you were the one making that awesome piece of work. So people would know that you are responsible. Okay, so that was everything I had for today. So that was a bit of computer history, my theory on how cracking contributed to the awesome access to hardware and software we see today, and a bit of scrolling down the FairLight release list. Thank you so much for watching, and see you next time. Bye bye.